So I'm going to turn it over to Vern now, and Peter when he gets over here with his skis, and they'll either tell you a little bit about what we're going to do, or you'll head out into the field.
Okay, so I think we'll just start hoofing it. I am hopelessly blinded by fogging with the mask, so I'm going to be very intermittent with it. Keep distancing and all that. And we are compromised by a lot of times. I always talk about in the winter when you're trying to identify trees, which we don't have to talk just about identifying trees, any ecological science, bio, snow thing we want to talk about. But I always start off with a big part of winter identification of trees is looking down as opposed to looking up, meaning you look for what the tree has dropped and what's under it. Well, right now we got a foot of snow over a lot of that, so we'll see how that goes. But then there's other things. We'll go over here and talk about the soft maple for a second and then head out across the field. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah.
This is a red maple, also known as a soft maple. And a very common maple tree around here. Spectacular fall color, great habitat for all sorts of birds and animals. It's called soft maple as a common name because it's closely related species of the sugar maple, which you've all heard of, where maple syrup comes from, is also known as hard maple. The wood is much, much harder in sugar maple or hard maple compared to its close relative, the red maples, also known as soft maples. I love common names. We can get into Latin names, which are cool too, but common names have a real meaning for us right away. Another, and we'll see this with any luck if we get across the meadow and towards the wetland areas, this is also known as swamp maple because it will grow in a wet area up on little hummocks that it sort of creates for itself over time. So it's red maple, soft maple, or swamp maple. And no matter what you call it, it'll always show you these fat, plump red buds out of the very end of the twigs. I don't know if you can see it, but hopefully you can. And I would say one other thing. So swamp maple, sugar maple just won't grow when they're super wet. Doesn't like it at all. So it doesn't get a third common name. It's sugar maple or hard maple. Another thing that's very common for all maples, and it's a very fundamental tree identification, is that they have opposite branches. By opposite branches, it means that at each node, which is a place along a twig where little branches come off to the side, or where leaves come out, there's a node. At nodes, the branches are exactly opposite each other, as opposed to alternate, which means it'd be one on the left-hand side and then you go up a little further and another one emerges on the right. Now in soft maple, you can see that, but it's not as distinct as you might think, and you really got to train your eye to see it. I can see it nicely if you get out within 6 inches of the end of a twig or a foot, follow it down right from the end, and see those first little branches that come off of the side, and they're right opposite each other. The reason I bring that up now is because when we get out and look at the ash tree that Peter and I love, we'll talk about that when we get out there.
It's much easier to see the branching.
It's so much easier to see that opposite branch. Okay, all maples, and there's 7 or 8 species of maple around here, have that distinctive opposite branching at the nodes. Maples, ash, and dogwood. When I was in Boy Scouts, I learned the phrase mad dog. Maples, ash, and dogwood are the native species around here that have that opposite branching.
Doesn't hickory?
Hickory doesn't have it, but viburnums also do, but a mad dog viburnum doesn't really make any sense. But anyway, we'll talk more about that. The reason why I'm emphasizing it is that it's such a fundamental feature for helping you identify trees, especially in big shrubs, woody shrubs, especially in the winter. And it seems like a simple thing, but it can be tricky because some trees, it's not as distinct as others, but it's still there. And if you see it quite obviously in 1 or 2 spots, then the opposite branching, then you know that is the character, even though you don't see it at every node. Okay, so we'll kind of just walk along and out to where we can view a big healthy ash tree and talk about ashes, if that's good. Anyone want to hazard a guess at what kind of a tree it is? You don't have to.
already gave away.
Yeah,
Oh,
into elm.
Peter already did. It is an elm, but it's not a white elm or an American elm. It's some, and it doesn't really totally remind me of the an Oriental elm that was brought in. I think it's some kind of a hybrid. I'm not sure. It's definitely an elm, and it was probably planted, oh, I don't know, 80 years ago maybe. What do you think, Peter? But
Yeah.
and the reason why Chinese elm, which this is not, and then there's another Oriental elm, and then various crosses of all those were brought was because they were a little more resistant to Dutch elm disease. You've all heard about Dutch elm disease, which decimated all of our native elms. There's still a lot of slippery elms around. They tend to be smaller and they're a little more resistant to the disease, but eventually they get it and go. There's very few true American white elms around. There's two in Woodstock, one behind the community center by the playground, and another at, what's the name of the farm at the end of Beaver Road?
Oh,
Longyear Farm. Yeah, thank you. It's a huge one at Longyear Farm. Anyway, so a lot of these other variations of elms, different species, and crosses between them were brought in because they were more resistant to the elm disease. And so you see them around. They're not the same though, you know, they're not quite as grand in my mind. They don't have that beautiful feather duster shape that so expresses the American elm, but it hints at it, and it's still a lovely tree. Okay. This tree on the end is a white ash, northern white ash, and it is the most common ash tree we have around here, the most common species. And for the most part, all the ash trees in this immediate area for like a 15-mile radius from here and rapidly expanding have been killed by the emerald ash borer. This tree, for a couple of reasons, I'm not sure which, is still really healthy. And we can talk about that, but first I want to go back to the example of opposite branching, which the white ash especially is one of the best examples of that opposite branching, and you can really see it right up at the very ends of the branches where it's almost candelabra-like or cruciform. Distinctly can see those big, heavy opposite branches. You go right to the end of a branch, the tip, and work your way down, and then you see this branches that are very opposite each other. And once you get that look in your mind, you can identify ash trees from here to across the street, because there's nothing else around here that's that distinctive in terms of opposite branching. Another very interesting thing about ash trees is they're what we call dioecious. Di meaning two, ecious meaning forms. So there's two sexes, well, obviously male and female, but one tree is one or the other. One tree is a male or a female, where most angiosperms, which are flowering plants, of which most of our hardwood trees are, have both sexes on the same plant or even within the same flower. Your typical flower, you know, the anther and the stamens and the stigma and all that are. But this is separate in ash trees. It's either male or female. This happens to be a male. And you can tell that, not today because they've all fallen off, but in the spring it'll have little ping pong ball sized, very round, dark inflorescences, as we call them, which are the stamen, the pollen-bearing flowers or groups of flowers that are quite distinctive. And that caught my eye this spring on this one. So now we know that it's a male ash tree. The female flower, very tiny little spike that you can't really see unless you make a point of getting up there and taking a close look. So, why is this tree so
Why
healthy?
is it still alive?
And this one you'd be treating, right?
It has not been treated yet.
Oh,
I
it
was
hasn't?
going to treat it this year.
Okay.
There's a very effective treatment for ash trees by injecting a true insecticide. Sorry about that. Um, into the tree. It works really, really well, but you've got to do it before the tree is more than a third dead, give or take. So anyway, on the opposite end of this, I call this the island, this little raised part in the field here. Right down to the other end, there's two other ash trees. One on the far right is totally dead. You can sort of see it behind that. And then there's a couple on the left side that are almost dead. So one reason why this ash tree could be so healthy is because it's way out here in the middle and isolated from all the other ash trees that are dead over there. And in other words, what we call escapes. It just didn't happen to get found by the adult beetles that are flying around in May looking for a tree to feed upon and then lay its eggs upon. So that was what I originally thought about this, but then I noticed that it was just a lucky escape because it's so far away. But then I saw the other dead ash trees right over next to it, which I said, well, this is either a really lucky escape or there's possibility that it's resistant to some degree. It has some natural inborn resistance. There's a
And that needs to be cultivated then.
Yeah, I was gonna say, would
Yeah.
you study that tree then somehow?
Get some genetics studies.
glad to say I've got the answer for that. There's a project, I'm not sure what botanical garden it is, but somewhere down in New York City where there's all sorts of really good ones. There's a project called the Lingering Ash Project where they are looking for trees just like this that have survived amongst many others that have died. And this is the best example I know. So I've notified my friend Molly, who heads that program up, and theoretically this is on the list to come this spring and take samples, and then it would have to be propagated vegetatively by tissue cultures, which they can do. So anyway, with any luck, knock on wood, and I don't want to blow the chances by saying it, this could be the tree that we're looking for. The one that's really resistant. Or it could just be really, really lucky. Or it could have some degree of resistance to slowing it down, and maybe some borers have started to get in there, but they just aren't doing it very quickly. But we are going to treat it this spring.
Are there any signs that you can see that it has been attacked?
That's a great question. There are distinctive signs. One is it starts thinning at the top. You start getting shoots coming out that are kind of abnormal, adventitious shoots where the tops are dying back a little, and therefore lateral buds lower down are released from the suppression of the end branches, and they start popping up. And then the biggest, easiest to see, there's other ones, symptom or sign, is when the woodpeckers start going after the larvae that are in the tree. They fleck off the outer bark, and you see little patches of white, yellow, or it can be a whole big area. It's called blonding because the original color is kind of blonde. And there's none of that going on in this tree.
Isn't there sometimes little tiny holes too where the
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
little holes
Tiny,
where the
tiny.
adult beetles emerge,
yeah.
but they're very small and they're D-shaped. If you go online, you say, oh, that's the definitive character. If you find the D-shaped holes, then you know it's emerald ash borer. And it's true, but it's really hard to find those little holes. They're not big. And they are distinctively D-shaped. Why? Because the adult borer is in what's called the flat-headed borer group, and they're flat on one side, and when they eat their way out, they leave a hole that's flat on their bottom side. This is a very similar insect. The bronze birch borer, same genus, Agrylus, and also the two-line chestnut borer that are all very, very similar insects, and same genus, same kinds of life cycle. But the other two are native, and the trees around here have some degree of evolutionized resistance. And so those insects will kill those trees, but only when they're stressed out from other things usually. Whereas the emerald ash borer is introduced from China. It comes in and has no respect for anything, except for maybe this guy.
That's why introduced species are so harmful.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
No, that's because it's immediate and they haven't had time to evolve,
Yeah.
right, and
Yeah.
resist.
Yeah. I mean, it's a well-worn story. The Dutch elm disease is the same thing, although it's a fungus. Many other
Oh yeah.
things that you
Loads
hear
and
of
loads
ravaging plant diseases or tree diseases, that's usually an introduced species that gets in here and just has its way.
Chestnut, is that?
Chestnut was also, and that required an insect, which makes wounds, same with the emerald or the Dutch elm disease, both an insect and a fungus, a combination that work together. And
nasty.
Were they both invasive
yeah,
from,
yeah,
from somewhere else?
yeah.
Oh.
Can't we assume though that these trees are related though, since they're so close to each other, and
That's
they would
a
have
very,
the
very,
same
very good question. and
genetic makeup?
Yeah, that introduces it a lot. They could be the ones down here seem a little younger than this one. They could be progeny from this. Well, they wouldn't be progeny from seeds from this because this is just male.
Male, yeah.
So somehow, if they were related to this one, either they came in at the same time with a bunch of seeds that were blowing in,
Yeah.
carried in by birds or whatever, or longer shot would be that pollen found its way into maybe one of them are females down there. See what I'm saying? Then they'd have to get the seed, and usually to have the 100%, say this is really resistant, I don't want to keep saying it because I know it's too good to be true. If you were to breed that into a female that showed no resistance, you wouldn't necessarily get all the progeny, all the seeds from that being resistant, because that's the way sex works. That's why no two people are alike, and that's why no two trees are alike, unless you reproduce it vegetatively, which means you take the exact genetics from the buds of this tree and manipulate it, make it grow over and over again so it's an exact copy. And most of your cultivars of trees, like anytime you get a specific cultivar, which is a cultivated variety, they are cultivated to have those specific characters reliably by vegetative propagation. What's the biggest example of that? Apple trees. And budding, you bud
Yeah, all the varieties.
all the grafting of apple
Hundreds
trees.
of varieties.
Hundreds of varieties. Apples are notorious for not breeding true. I mean, you take the seeds from a Golden Delicious and plant it, you're not going to get a Golden Delicious tree. You might get some that look sort of like it, but there's going to be a whole big smear of differences. Leaf abscission, the falling off of the leaves in the fall, is an active physiological process where a hormone called abscisic acid, abscission, stimulates a little line of dead cells, or stimulates the process where right at the end of the leaf blade, the leaf petiole, the leaf stem, dies off, and that's where the leaves break off. It's an active
interesting.
process. So anyway, that's a distinctive feature of oak trees, especially in the red oak group.
You were saying they create a little line of dead cells. Is that causes it to break off, or?
Right, that's an active process in the fall as the days start getting shorter. And interestingly, on a physiological level, we all say day length or photoperiod, the length of the day, trigger all sorts of plant changes. But
And animal changes too.
and animal changes and human changes probably. But what some very observant physiologists about 30 years ago discovered was that the plants are really responding to the length of darkness and not the length of the light period on a physiological basis. So it's really length of night and increasing nighttime and not decreasing daytime that the plants are relating to when they start getting ready for winter and start going into dormancy, of which shedding the leaves in the hardwoods is a big part of. So anyway, for some reason, the abscission layer, which is that layer that develops at the base of the leaf petiole, which is the stem that the leaf holds onto the twig with, doesn't completely do its thing in these oaks. And I don't know why that is.
So do these eventually fall off when the new leaf pushes it off or something?
Yeah, over the winter, they can hold them, but yeah, they will eventually fall off. But in the weather, the wind blows, you know,
Yeah,
as the
yeah.
winter goes on, they get beat up a little more. But it's much more of a gradual process. Ooh, I feel much better without that layer.
Yeah, it's like,
Oh, good cold, yeah. Well, oaks, all the different species of oaks have really obvious, right? The very terminal bud is often a cluster of 4 or 5 different buds. And a lot of species, a lot of genera like maples, you can differentiate the species by the terminal buds, and like the red bud, the red round fat buds of the red maple is much different than the more single pointed thinner brown buds of the sugar maple. Oak buds are often clustered anywhere from 3 to 7 buds at the end. And there are subtle differences between species. You can just really see it in this light, these gray clusters. The difference between the species is not that clear cut always.